Hi, this is Mark from Dragon Force.
This is Nora from Battle Beast.
This is Jarvis Leatherby from the band Night Demon.
Hey guys, this is Thomas from Camelot.
This is Ida from Trisphere, and you are listening to the Great Metal Debate podcast.
Hey podcast listeners, welcome back to the show for another metal artist interview. I'm joined by John and Tony of West Coast power metal clan Judicator. Thank you all so much for joining us on the Great Metal Debate.
Excellent to be here.
Yes, thank you for having us. We're excited.
Now, for folks who aren't familiar with Judicator, can you give us briefly the origin story of the band?
Yeah, absolutely. To put it pretty briefly, we met at a Blind Guardian concert in 2010. I was there seeing my buddies in Seven Kingdoms open for Blind Guardian. Of course, Blind Guardian's one of my favorite bands. John had driven down with his dad to see the show because it was the only way he was going to see him because they didn't go to his area. And I bumped into him at the start of the show, and he was hanging out real early in the venue, and he was there by himself. And I said, dude, why don't you just come backstage with us? And instead of hanging outside here in the middle of the desert. And, of course, he came right along, and we went backstage, got to see Soundcheck, got to see one of our favorite bands play, and we got to talking and swapped information and connected after the show a few months later and got to talking about, hey, wouldn't it be cool to start a power metal band just like in the vein of Blind Guardian and all that music that brought us together in the first place. And from there we made our first album, which was a really quick demo project in a bedroom, and people started listening to it, and we were like, hey, maybe we're onto something here, and we decided to keep going and keep escalating things until we find ourselves here.
You mentioned the term power metal. Broadly, what is it you all are trying to accomplish musically with the band Judicator? What is the sound you're trying to create?
For me, my favorite kind of metal is stuff that's obviously melodic and fast and riff-oriented, but also not confined to some people are very it has to be old school death metal or it has to be old school thrash metal or whatever it is. And while we definitely root ourselves in the old school power metal, we like taking that in a modern context. So, but still keeping the riff-based orientation and the song-based orientation with the strong choruses and lots of vocal layering. So really just keeping that old school power metal vibe alive, but also, not being afraid to pull in our other influences outside of the primary thing.
Lyrically, Judicator has some clear historical themes in your albums. Other bands, Sabaton comes to mind, have had a lot of success with that. Can you speak to both the challenges and the possibilities of employing historical narratives in the music?
The tough thing is always finding... so every Judicator album is, of course, a concept album. And so whatever I'm nerding out on at the time that we are in development for the album, of course, you need to choose material that fits the mood of the album that we are working on. And once that is done, of course, the tricky thing is to find the songs that best fit each period so it's just a matter of finding what parts of the story you want to tell fit with each song and making it all mesh together in a way that's cohesive and fits the flow of the album, I guess. And, of course, doing all the research and homework to make sure it's historically accurate. And a good story.
Is that a big part of it, just that you have these colorful, full stories that lend themselves to creating on the musical side alongside the story?
Yeah. I I mean, the easy part is there is such a wealth of historical information to draw from. I think the trick is just telling it in a way that has not really been done before, and using information that if the story has been told before, drawing on information and stories and anecdotes that have not been told before. And I think case in point is Rome, like the way that King of Rome tells Napoleon's return from exile covers a lot of material that was not covered in, for instance, the old movie Waterloo. So I think that adds a little bit of value to the content.
We mentioned power metal earlier, and the genre issue or question is one that gets a lot of play, and it's a topic that we often debate on this podcast. From your all's perspective as artists, to what extent is it appropriate to use those category markers to identify musical styles, and to what extent do you think it's not a valid discussion?
So for me, I just, having spent a lot of time in subgenre discussion over the years, I think there is a point and purpose to genre classification, and then I think that there is a point where people get absurd. So for me, I think that there's enough talk in the communities of music to agree upon what the main genres are, and then like nobody's going to argue with you that thrash metal is a genre, and nobody's going to argue with you that what the defining characteristics of it are. I think where people get tripped up is when you start hearing them say that this is dark symphonic pirate metal, and they start getting into like things that are more stylistic descriptions. And it's fine to have stylistic descriptions, and I differentiate style from genre, because genre to me is like your foundation, your building blocks, whereas style is like the things that you decorate your house with. So for instance, we play power metal, right? But if you were going to call it like historical power metal, it's not really a genre. It's just a description of the style. But some people will act like things like that are actual genre classifications, when really, to me, it's more about the fundamental building blocks of the genre. And then you'll get weird things where people try to misattribute genres, and some lines are definitely blurred, like especially when you look at, like, the 80s is a great time to look at, because so many genre tags flew around and like went from various style to style. Like people called Venom black metal when they first started because of their eponymous album, but nobody would really call that style black metal today if it came out. Or for instance, everything was speed metal in the 80s, and now it's hard to hear anybody really call anything straight up speed metal these days, because it's a more nebulous term that got applied to a lot of different things, and a lot of things that were called speed metal in the 80s ended up being death metal and thrash metal and power metal as they developed more. So I think time helps us define those things more, but then I think people get a little too in their, I want to call them fan clubs, their little fandoms, and they get way too absurdly specific, and I think it misses the point at that point. Like, genres are useful to help us identify tastes and categorize things so that we can easily link them to each other, but when you get too specific and too away from the things that people generally talk about, I think you kind of miss the point, and then that's when I check out of the conversation.
Do you ever run into fans who at times are just super into what you're doing because of the genre identification, or do you find more often than not it tends to limit and maybe prevent fans from taking a listen where they might actually enjoy your music?
I think in both cases. So definitely, power metal is an interesting genre in a modern context, because especially being a power metal band from the United States, especially being a power metal band from a state where, one, there aren't many metal bands from to begin with, and two, where there certainly are no power metal bands except for a couple of bands that have some demos out. It's very interesting because, one, it immediately brings attention to you because of the genre. Like, oh, wow, there's like German-style power metal from Arizona. That's crazy. So people like pay attention to that. However, it's like you mentioned, on the flip side, power metal has certain stigmas around it, so that prevents some people from looking at it. They go, "Oh, power metal, that's like Sonata Arctica, right? I'm not going to listen to that." And lo and behold, we sound nothing like them. So it kind of works both ways. In some ways, it pulls people to you, and in other ways, it can drive people away. Especially one that's, I'd say, power metal is one of the geekier fringe genres of the metal genre, and it has some certain stereotypes attached to it. And to me, like, every genre has those stereotypes, but they get played up more in power metal just because it tends to be on the more over-the-top theatrical side of things. So I'd say there's both pros and cons, and it's just been interesting to me to see, the both sides of it, and especially having played a lot of different genres in my musical career. I've played in just about any type of metal band. I've done country. I've played pop music for a little bit. I've done session work on rap music. Just kind of all over the place, and I've never quite found that level of I'll call it genrecism as there is in power metal. And it's interesting, like it's kind of endearing in a way too, because it is a more fringe genre. It definitely doesn't have much of a following in the States, but I'd say it swings both ways, and I just enjoy seeing the different reactions based on it. And the cooler thing to me is when people's expectations are subverted one way or the other. Like, they'll go in and be like, "Oh man, this is power metal, this is gonna suck," and then they hear that it's got a lot of influences from maybe something that they like that's not power metal, and then they go, "Oh wow, I actually really like this." Or on the flip side, it's also kind of entertaining to me when somebody goes into it expecting Rhapsody of Fire or something, and while I love that band, we don't sound anything like them, and I can definitely not play guitar like that. And then they go in and they're like, "Oh nope, this is crap. I don't like this. I thought I was going to like it based on what it was labeled, but nope, that's not for me." And that's just really interesting to me when those expectations are kind of turned on their head.
You mentioned some other styles of music. I wonder if each of you could speak for a moment about your respective musical backgrounds. Did you grow up in musical environments, and did either of you receive any formal training?
Yeah, I took formal vocal lessons for about 6 years, and I took that experience and gave lessons myself for a number of years, off and on. And that was a great experience. Since I was a kid, I've been playing guitar, piano mostly, but I also did trumpet and trombone throughout high school and junior high, but I never carried that out beyond after graduating. So yeah, I've been very focused on vocals since then, trying to stay in my lane. I'd rather be really good at one thing than spread out my time and energy across other instruments.
Yeah, speaking to my musical background a bit, I grew up partially in Arizona, but I'm from Bristol, Tennessee, so I grew up around a lot of country music, and my uncle was the lap steel guitar player for Charlie Bride until he unfortunately passed away. So there was a strong kind of musical background in my family. My dad is a record collector. When I was a kid, we used to look through his vinyl records and listen to all his classic rock records, and that's how I got into Deep Purple and Uriah Heep and all that kind of stuff. And then that slowly branched out into finding heavy metal later, which is where I kind of found my identity, despite being exposed to those other influences, but having that kind of diverse, different cultural background definitely caused me to experiment and explore different things as I was learning the guitar. I didn't take formal guitar lessons, but I took formal music theory lessons, so I self-taught guitar. But then I took a lot of music theory education throughout high school and my college education, which isn't in music, but I took a lot of my, what do you call them, electives in music, like I did a few jazz theory classes, a few general music theory classes, just to keep up my, I call it professional development in the musical field. So I've just always been curious to learn and see how that applies to the things that I like, and see how the bands that I like incorporate different influences and make it into something that we all share and love.
Well, guys, let's turn from the past to the present and talk a moment about your latest album, The Last Emperor, released just this past March. What's been the response so far to that album?
For me, it's been the biggest response we've had. We've definitely seen our fan base grow quite a bit. We've seen more engagement, more. The number of reviews is much higher. The number of records we're getting asked to send for promotional stuff is much higher. We've worked with Alone Records on a vinyl release, which just released the other day. So that was a huge benchmark for us. I'm very into vinyl myself, so having my own record come out on that medium was something I knew I'd never afford on myself, just because it's such a cost-intense medium to do in low production runs, and having that happen was really cool. Of course, having Auntie Kirsch on the album was a dream come true. Just made my head spin a little bit to get to work with my favorite metal singer. And then overall, there was kind of some trepidation on our part going from our last album to this one, because our last album was much more progressive and personal in nature, and this album was just a straight for the throat, punch you in the face power metal album. So we were kind of nervous, maybe people, because our last album got us a lot more attention than our first two did, and we were nervous that maybe the straightforward style wouldn't resonate with people. It was a bit of a change-up, and actually a lot of people are going actually this album we like the last one and we like this one more. And some people still prefer the other one, and that's great. I personally prefer At the Expense of Humanity, but just to see that some people, a lot of the overwhelming response has been yep, this is you guys in your prime, this is you in your top form, has been really, after a lot of nervousness around the album, made that pay off really great to feel oh wow, we really are working in the right direction. Decision, the hard work that we put into it is definitely, those were smart decisions, and it's nice to see people appreciate that and engage with that and have it open new opportunities for us as well.
Yeah, I would say that the biggest relief for me was that nervousness around a follow-up to At the Expense of Humanity, which was reviewed so well. You have that worry that, man, anything we come up with after a high watermark like that is going to be crapped on, or people are always going to be saying it's good but not as good as that, and we haven't had as much of that. It's been a very positive response, and so I'm very thrilled and happy and relieved, because I love the album, and it seems like everybody else does. So in addition to all of the real world benefits we've had, like Tony mentioned, just on a personal level, it's very rewarding.
So were the changes from the last album, At the Expense of Humanity, was that an attempt to maybe go back to the roots, or was that just where you were at when you were writing The Last Emperor?
It was sort of...
For me, it was... You go first, John.
Sorry, man. It was sort of a great way to take the spirit from our first two albums, which did not have the best production quality, and put it into a new, fresh perspective with top-of-the-line production and still a historical approach like the first two albums.
Yeah, I think John hit it on the head. It was, for me, it was taking the lessons learned from those two albums and then doing it with, 5 more years of experience, a heck of a lot more resources, kind of with, instead of just an idea that we did what we could with, making it, its full version of itself with all of our best cards on the table, basically bringing that full potential out, which is actually why we decided to re-record the song King of Rome from our first album, because it's a song that's very important to us, and that's why we chose to make a video to it rather than a song from The Last Emperor itself, just because it's sort of a subtle nod to that. And our next album or 3 probably will sound nothing in this direction, because, for me personally, I feel like I accomplished what I wanted to do in that direction, which was to just have a really gutsy, fun, to the point power metal record with all those musical lessons and professional lessons learned from our first three adventures. And I feel that the response has definitely validated that. So it was definitely like a little bit of an intentional, like, let's take a step back and do it better this time. Do it the best we can this time.
You talk about the development of the sound and the production quality. Can you talk a little bit more about that as far as when you look back to where you were for those first two albums production-wise and just what you could envision? Do you look back and say, oh, man, I'm embarrassed at that, or do you just feel like that was kind of the raw, undiluted place you were at that point?
Yeah, I definitely don't feel embarrassed by it. I mean, I don't know that our first album is what I'd call super listenable from a production standpoint. The second one I don't have too many qualms about, but they were also made very quick on a $0 production budget. So to me, they're kind of neat representations of where we were, because the first album we recorded as like something between us that we didn't think anyone was going to listen to. So, you know, we did it in 3 weeks on our laptops, and we put it up on Bandcamp, and we're like, gee, that was sure fun. See you later, man. And then people started listening to it, and people started buying it, and you know, we eventually got enough demand for a CD pressing, and it sold out instantly, and all these reviews kept coming in, and we're like, wow, that happened with that much effort. Gee, I wonder what would happen if we took a little more of a serious turn onto it, which was our second album, which was us basically doing the same thing as the first, but taking our time this time, and doing it a little more seriously. And it still definitely had opportunities, and we're actually looking at remixing and remastering and then punching in some re-records of some specific parts of that album, just to get something that's a little more on par with our last two out of it. This is like a year from now we're talking, but I definitely think it's a cool representation of what you can do on limited resources when all you really have is your passion for the music. And then just the fact that people engaged with that and latched onto it. Like I've recorded plenty of other albums in a similar fashion that no one ever listened to. So just to see people latch onto the music, whether in spite of that or because of that, and then to actually use it as a launch point into better things. Like, who knew that recording a demo quality album would lead to us collaborating with Blind Guardian, for instance? Like, that's just unfathomable to me when I look back on it. So for me, I feel a point of pride on those first two albums, even if it's not apparent from listening to like a cut from the King of Rome album. I think the story's there, and I think the narrative is very cool in and of itself.
So should I take that to mean that you all are pleased with what you did re-recording the King of Rome song, that you are considering doing that with some additional older tracks?
Oh, yeah. It was fun to bring that to life, for sure. Just to hear it, like, with the big production and, like, the vocal layers, and then to get to shoot a music video, because we always love playing that one live. It's our closing song, and people love singing along to it. And so to put that in that updated context, that was probably one of the funnest, like, most heartwarming things about this album cycle.
Yeah, I'm very proud of what we did with the first two albums. They're not like professional quality production, but there's a lot of heart and soul in there. Like Tony said, the story is all there, and it's really heartful and soulful. And man, I tell you, I wish that we had unlimited time and resources, because to be honest, there's probably a handful of songs that I would love to re-record off of King of Rome and even Sleepy Plesso. But like Tony mentioned before, we're in the works with something to touch up Sleepy Plesso. So we're going to try to do what we can on that.
You mentioned earlier the vocal contribution from the legendary Hansi from Blind Guardian on the track Spiritual Trees, and how did that collaboration come about?
I worked with Hansi before on a song in a band that I was in called Dysphoria back in 2014. And since then, we've become pen pals. Whenever he comes through the U.S. with Blind Guardian, we hang out. Tony and I hung out with him when they came through Colorado in 2015, I think. So since then, I've really wanted to get him onto a Judicator track, and luckily the stars kind of aligned for The Last Emperor and Hansi's schedule, so we were able to get him on. And I love the guy. I mean, I've offered on a couple of occasions to pay him, and he accepts no money, so that means a lot. Yeah. He's one of the few people who walks the walk and talks the talk as far as supporting local artists and young musicians and stuff like that.
That's amazing to have that level of support and contribution from someone who really is a legend and whose work stands on its own. That must be incredible to have that kind of relationship, and also I would think would put you in the position where you would hope someday to be in the position to help someone else out as well.
Yeah, that's definitely what I think it's all about, is planting those seeds of kindness and hoping that they take root within the people that you try to instill that, and always try to pay it forward.
Now, the songs on The Last Emperor, were those all written to the release, or had you had some of those songs in the works years before, maybe leftovers from previous album writing sessions?
Pretty much everything from The Last Emperor musically was written shortly after I finished writing At the Expense of Humanity, which was probably sometime in like mid-2014. The album actually went through a lot of rewrites because I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with it. We had talked about doing some different material before doing this, and actually one of the songs, as late as February of last year, got rewritten entirely. So it went through a few different versions, but it started pretty much right after the At the Expense of Humanity production wrapped up. And I usually work on songs over the course of years. Like our next album has stuff that I've been working on since probably 2013, I want to say. And it just depends on where the material is at in its particular time, and where it's at development-wise, and how it fits into a certain album. So some songs have kind of like flip-flopped between different potential albums that we're working on. So, for instance, we have our 5th album already musically written. John's been working on the lyrics and the vocal melodies the last few weeks. But the song Nothing But Blood off of The Last Emperor was actually supposed to be on that first. And it just turned out that it felt like it fit better on this album. So we pulled it over to this material and, threw out another song that didn't feel as strong, just because you kind of listen to songs next to each other when you're writing a concept album, and you look for what flows the best for the kind of story you're going for. So since it's not about the individual song, but how well does it sit between the two songs around it? How does it fit in the overall album? So that can be a determining factor for sure that will cause us to maybe hang on to a song for a year or two, or generate completely new material, whatever it happens to be. So Last Emperor definitely went through some strenuous rewrites, and At the Expense of Humanity had stuff that I've been working on for 6 or 7 years, since even before Judicator was a band. But every musician kind of has their riff vault that they work through, so you pull from that. But yeah, Last Emperor was generally fresh material, and we pulled some stuff from some other projects we've been working on.
And is that your fairly consistent process for Judicator, that you would write the music and then the lyrics would be added at the last part, or is that simply the process that you employed in Last Emperor?
Yeah, typically I will write all the music to the album first, and then John will take it and he will listen to it. And he's always got ideas in his head, and I'm sure he'll say more about it. And then based on how the music is pinging, determines the lyrical theme, and then he builds the lyrical and vocal melodies off of that. And if we need to go back and change things to fit things, we will. Sometimes I'll go back and change a guitar harmony, or move where a guitar solo is supposed to be, or we'll repeat a section more to fit more vocals in, or condense a section down if we didn't feel like it needed that much space. Make those minor adjustments, but the bulk of the music, 90% of it is written beforehand and then the lyrics afterwards.
Yeah, generally I'll receive the album, like Tony said, and then I'll mull over various ideas that I would have had at that point. I've had a couple of ideas, one of which I'd been mulling around for a long time, but I ultimately decided it wasn't quite yet time to use on this album. So we've actually decided to go with an idea for the next album that is complementary to The Last Emperor, which is, so the Crusades were, of course, a Roman Catholic endeavor, so then we're going, and a Western Roman-like endeavor, essentially. So then we're going to flip on the next album to the Eastern Roman Empire, being the Byzantines. So it's going to be sort of a neat way to maintain continuity with the content, but also allow for a progression between the musical styles of the albums.
We've had several metal acts from the West Coast on the podcast. The guys in Holy Grail, Jarvis from Night Demon, Heather from Grave Shadow, the folks in Adavant. What's the metal scene like out on that end of the country, and especially given the distances you don't have out here on the eastern side of the country, how challenging is it to put tours together where you can get out to see fans?
It's playing live is extremely strenuous for us because we're not in the same location. So John lives in Salt Lake City, and the rest of the band lives in Tucson, which are about 1,200 miles apart. So that's a logistical challenge in and of itself. And then, to drive anywhere of note from Tucson or even from Salt Lake City, it's some of our drives on our last tour were 16 hours. We drove something like 6,000 miles on our last tour, and it was a very small tour. It was 2 weeks, just 6 shows, so it took that much effort to get to that many places where there's enough of a scene for us to have a worthwhile show. And fortunately, all those places we go, Portland, Denver, Salt Lake City, Long Beach, LA, Sacramento, they've all got really strong scenes. Denver is incredible as far as the plethora of talent there and amazing fans that are there, but it's a challenge logistically to get there and to make it financially viable. And then the amount of time you need to travel those distances. So it's very, very difficult for us to tour. We only played, 15-some shows. In total, we've been pretty much everywhere on the West Coast, Southwest, a little bit of the Pacific Northwest. We went out as far as Florida a few years ago, but we haven't done any touring recently just because of how tough it can be to get together. And we're kind of at this point, we'll do some one-off shows, play here, maybe play in Denver or something like that. But we're kind of not, I don't want to use the phrase saving ourselves, but being really, really picky about how we play live, just because when you're in a band like this, like the band is financially viable right now, as long as we're smart about it, but all it takes is one bad business decision to potentially cripple our ability to produce music. So right now, The Last Emperor has been a very good album cycle for us. The last tour cycle is very good for us. If I make the wrong decision in how we approach playing live, that might delay the next album by 3-4 years, or potentially, become a personal financial burden, which I'm always willing to invest my own money. That's how the band started. You invest a little, you got to spend money to make money. And I wish it wasn't as, driven by business decisions as it is, especially at our lower level in comparison to bands like bands that go and play sold out tours in Europe. But it can be the difference between being able to keep doing what you like doing or what you love doing and not doing it at all. So if we want to keep producing great albums, we have to make sure that we have the financial viability to do that. So that means making smart live decisions. So doing a DIY tour, 20 shows across the United States, and taking a month off from our jobs could go really well, or it could go really bad. So we always have to be careful. And fortunately, my background is in business, and I've got a good eye for logistics and stuff. But sometimes it's like, wow, I'd really like to do this, but I know if I do this, like, album 5 might not happen. So when I say we're saving ourselves, we're looking for those opportunities where either the financial cost is good, or the non-financial benefits outweigh the financial burden. So, like, there's some bigger tour opportunities that might come our way at some point. We've talked about a few options that, they would hurt financially, but the practical non-financial gain of it, the musical gain of it, the experience gain, the exposure gain far outweighs that, and that would be the right decision to make. Or if it's a worthwhile festival, and we've talked about playing a few next year. There's 3 that we're looking at potentially, and one, unfortunately, is probably not going to happen. But they all have the discussion point of like, hey, this might be worth it. We should really realistically look at what we need to do to make this happen and what the results of that would be.
You were the one who mentioned Europe, so I have to ask about that because I could see stylistically there's got to be a lot of people across the pond who would be very excited to hear you all live. Is that something that's even kind of in the margins of your consideration, going over to Europe?
Yeah, we there's nothing concrete right now, but we have made, you kind of have your in case of emergency break glass plan for when the stars align for those opportunities. So we just speaking to where our merchandise sells, like the vast majority of it sells to Europe. Most of our CDs go to Europe. All of our distribution deals are in Europe. The record label that's producing our vinyl release is in Europe and distributes all throughout Europe. So while we do have a really good local following stateside in our regional area, definitely I think if one of those opportunities came about, and some of the ones we've talked about, it would most likely be on that side of the pond. So we've had the kind of come to Jesus, sit down, talk about, okay, when this happens, have we looked at every angle of our lives and financial status and agreed that we can make this work? And yep, okay, we know what we have to do in this situation. So if Mr. Opportunity comes knocking with the right deal, we're making sure that we're in the position to take that.
Well, I think that would be awesome. I'm among those who has my fingers crossed that that'll happen for you, because I know that would be a tremendous opportunity, and that fans in Europe would love to hear you guys. Wrapping up with you this evening, what is the best way for fans to purchase music and merchandise from Judicator, including the latest album, The Last Emperor?
So for people in the States, our Bandcamp is definitely the best way to do it, cheapest way to do it. You can get all our CDs there, our T-shirts, all that good stuff, digital versions. Of course, everything's on Amazon, iTunes, all that good stuff. For people overseas, we've got our albums, At the Expense of Humanity, is available through Dive Bomb Records, through several international distributors, so it's on all the different Amazon and eBay outlets. Alone Records from Greece is carrying The Last Emperor. We'll have the vinyl release, so that'll be available on the European side, so that they don't, you don't have to pay $20 of shipping through our Bandcamp. So I prefer people get the music the most effective way possible. Of course, if you want to go directly to the band, go through our Bandcamp, judicatormetal.bandcamp.com. And if you want a T-shirt, that's the only place to go for the moment. And then, for digital outlets, all the normal standard distributions. So whichever one works best for you and cheapest for you, that's the one I recommend.
Well, I want to encourage fans to do just that. Check out this latest album, The Last Emperor. Pick up that merch. This is a band worth supporting. Help get them across over to Europe. Guys, thank you all so much for joining us on The Great Metal Debate.
Thank you so much for having us. It was a lot of fun.
Really appreciate it, man. Thank you.